Let's look at the international context. That means international regulation, international action to combating financial crime. Let's start with the Financial Action Task Force. First, we said you might also know it in its French name, GAFI, is the main international body with the purpose of developing and promoting policies to combat money laundering and terrorist financing. We said they report to the United Nations, and in addition to issuing standards and guidelines and recommendations, they also do reviews of countries and organizations that are compliant or non-compliant with these standards. And they monitor. So even if they're not reviewing or they're not issuing standards, they are monitoring government, countries, and organizations. So they set standards, and we call these standards recommendations, the FATF 40 recommendations that cover the legal, regulatory, and operational measures for money laundering, terrorist financing, and proliferation financing. And of course, the rest of the illegal activities. Identify national level weaknesses. Usually, when we say national level weaknesses, that means weaknesses, government processes, weaknesses in laws passed by the parliament, weaknesses in the banking regulation from the central bank, weaknesses in regulations in the capital markets that basically open up loopholes for criminals. FATF monitor countries' progress, and they promote adoption and implementation of these recommendations. And let me just add here, and they report to the UN, because we are going to talk about the UN in more details as we move on. So there are 40 recommendations. Are you going to be question how many recommendations there are? Wow, I doubt. But I mean, it's a nice number to remember. Countries voluntarily sign up to the recommendations and to the mutual evaluation. Mutual evaluations or a mutual review is countries review each other. So Kenya, Germany, and Mexico, they send a team to review the UAE when it comes to money laundering. And UAE reviews Mexico, reviews Kenya, reviews Germany. So it's a mutual review. You review me, I review you. This ensures that there is fairness. These are soft law. That means they cannot be enforced because FATF is technically not a regulatory body. They do not have any legal power over governments, and they cannot enforce any obligations. And these mutual evaluations between these different countries are published, and financial institutions and governments use these in evaluating the risk posed by the different jurisdictions. And then they would say, I have to find this company, this government, or this country seems to be brazenly non-compliant, and they've been like that for many years. They don't want to listen, so we're going to put them on the blacklist. The European supervisory authorities, the ESAs, all you need to know is who they are. There are three main supervisors or supervisory authorities in the EU, and they cover banking, capital markets, and insurance. So the first one is called the European Banking Authority. The second one is called the European Securities and Markets Authority, ESMA. And the third one is called the European Insurance and Occupational Pension Authority, or EIOPA. Like most regulators around the world, you would see that they have two very main functions: protect the investors and ensure integrity and transparency in the market. If we go and when we study the FCA and when we study the SEC, and even if you look at other regulators regionally, like UAE or Kuwait or Qatar, you notice that the regulator, like ESCA, would say one of their responsibilities is to ensure investor protection and integrity and transparency in the markets. Of course, there are other functions. You can also have probably here, after 2008, many of them started talking about reducing systemic risk. As another function of these regulators. For many of them, you will see the word systemic risk and how to reduce it. Systemic risk is the risk of, I think we'll probably cover it tomorrow when we talk about risk management. Systemic risk is the risk of economic collapse. The 2008 financial crisis is an example of a systemic collapse, where the collapse of one company brought down the rest of the economy with it, brought down the rest of the world with it. So that systemic risk, which is extremely dangerous and very, very hurtful to the economy, many regulators following 2008 crash, many regulators have added this line to their regulation, add a reduced systemic risk. UK domestic regulators cooperate closely with the European regulators. And the two UK domestic regulators are the FCA and the PRA. So let's talk a bit about these two, because there is a chance you might get a question on these regulators. A long time ago, and by then I mean in 2008, and before 2008, the regulator in the UK used to be called the FSA, the Financial Services Authority. After 2008 financial crisis, the UK Parliament dissolved them. And out of the FSA, two regulators were born. The first one is called the PRA, which stands for the Prudential Regulatory Authority. And the second one is called the FCA, which is called the Financial Conduct Authority. So what's the difference between them? The PRA, first and foremost, the PRA is actually owned by the central bank, which is the Bank of England. And the PRA usually regulates banks and insurance companies. And the PRA is responsible for the stability of financial markets. Right. The FCA, on the other hand, it's not owned by anybody. They are independent. And they regulate brokerages, investment advisors, and so forth, anybody in the capital market. And their responsibility usually is conduct. And conduct is a very important term, especially when it comes to risk. In risk, there is something called conduct risk. Conduct risk is the risk that you do not conduct yourself in the manner expected of you with your customer. Conduct risk is very apparent in financial services because it is closely linked to moral hazard. Conduct risk, the way you conduct yourself towards your client. If you conduct yourself badly, then you're exposing your company to conduct risk. Conduct risk is very linked to something called moral hazard. Again, another financial compliance definition. What is moral hazard? Moral hazard is, to be honest, it's one of the things that don't have a straight definition also in finance. Moral hazard is you as a finance professional, you don't care of the consequences because you know that you'll not be punished. And you know that your regulator will not allow you to collapse. An example of that would be the 2008 financial crisis, when banks were selling or mis-selling products to customers, knowing that these products are bad, knowing that the customers will lose, knowing that these products are going to end up probably being useless, and they knew what they were doing, but they didn't care. Why? Because they were making money, and if they're ever caught, they know they're not going to go to jail. Nobody went to jail. And thirdly, they know that the central bank is going to bail them out. If anything happens to us as a bank, nobody's going to let us fail. So since the central bank, Big Papa, is going to come in and help us, then we don't care. Let's just make our money. Let's just sell bad products. Let's just hit our bonuses. You know, that's all we care about. So you conduct yourself in a way which is unprofessional, illegal, and it's just unseemly with your customer. So the FCA, the Financial Conduct Authority, so now that you understand really what conduct means, plays a big role in customer satisfaction in the UK. Here's another example. If you are missold a product, a banking product, by a bank in the UK, who do you complain them to? Well, most people would say, well, if the PRA regulates banks, then I will just complain them to the regulator, the PRA, the bank, the central bank. In reality, no, because mis-selling, when the bank missold you a product, they have conducted themselves illegally. And since this is considered conduct, you go and report them to the FCA. Even though the bank is regulated by the PRA, you will report them to the FCA. And that's why for many financial institutions in the UK, we call them twin regulated or twin peak regulation. That means they're regulated by both a regulator, the central bank, the PRA, and the FCA. And if you look at the logo of the FCA, FCA, you will notice that they have sort of a box on the letter C, and that box is colored in red. So it tells you that the FCA, I mean, they are highlighting in their brand, they are highlighting what they're there for. They are there for conduct in the markets. The US regulator is called the SEC. Yes, you might expect questions on which of the following is the US regulator, which of the following is the UK regulator, you know. You need to also memorize these. An agency of the US federal government enforces federal securities laws. So a law is passed by the Congress. A bill is passed by the Congress, it becomes a law. And the law is enforced by the different government agencies in the US. The police can enforce the law, the courts can enforce the law, and the SEC, the regulator, can also enforce laws that are related to securities. An example of this would be the SOX, the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002, which mainly talks about corporate governance. Any of you old enough to remember Enron? I mean, if you think about it, the year 2000 was really rough on us. 2000, 2001, with Enron and 9/11 and Bush and Iraq, it was really tough. So Sarbanes-Oxley Act came out in 2002 after the collapse of Enron. It talks mainly about corporate governance. And if you talk about more securities law, you've got the Glass-Steagall law, which came out after the Great Depression. Came out in the 30s, was it 1930? I might be mistaken. Which talks about the separation of investment banking from retail banking. Of course, Bill Clinton in the 90s repealed it. And then you've got the Dodd-Frank Act, of 2009, which came after the 2008 financial crisis, 2007-2008 financial crisis. And the Dodd-Frank Act basically said we need to work to reduce systemic risk, thereby limiting what banks that have both investment and retail arms, limiting them on what money they can play with or gamble with. And of course, President Trump in 2015 or 16 repealed most of the Dodd-Frank Act. He watered it down a lot. So these are some of the famous securities laws in the US. The SEC regulates securities rules, exchanges, electronic markets. Their mission is of three parts: protect investors. You see, protection of investors comes back, maintaining a fair and efficient market again, and then they've got something about facilitating capital formation. That's why usually when it comes to financial innovation, like the creation of ETFs, the invention of ETFs in the mid-90s, for example, crypto and other financial innovation, you'll notice that usually America is usually first to implement them. It's because the SEC, we're not saying that they are lax, no, but they are more open to ideas that, facilitate the movement of capital into the US. And of course, like all regulators around the world, the SEC works with different other regulators, such as the IOSCO, which is the regulator for regulators. IOSCO, SEC is a member of IOSCO, the FCA is a member of IOSCO, SK and the UAE is a member of IOSCO. More US offices, you've got, of course, the Office of Foreign Assets Control. This is the office that confiscates, freezes assets in the US. It administers and enforces economic and trade sanctions. Usually these economic and trade sanctions come from the UN. It can be from the FATF, from the recommendation from FATF, or from the recommendation of UN CAC or the UN ODC. And the UN decides, you know what, we're going to put Tadawul Academy on the sanction. The OFAC, India, because America is the biggest, what's the political term for it? Player in the United Nations. And they are also the first to enforce or implement whatever comes out of them. So they enforce UN Security Council resolutions and specially designated nationals. These are non-American individuals with whom Americans are banned from doing business with, or from doing business. So SDNs, or specially designated nationals, these are non-Americans with whom Americans are not allowed to transact with. Continuing with the international context, coordination and cooperation between regulators around the world. We talk about best practice, right? Because almost every industry probably has an association, or they probably have like an annual meeting or seminar or conference that they go to. Most industries in the US, they've got conferences and seminars for almost every industry. Are you in concrete and cement? There's an association for it. There's an annual meeting in Las Vegas. You can go and talk about concrete and cement, sometimes for days. So this is best practice. You exchange best practice with others. Globalization involves the opening up of world markets and the extension of trade and investment. Now, some people claim in the last couple of years, with the disagreements between America and China, globalization reduced a lot. And we started to feel that. The global GDP went down. and we've seen some problems with the supply chain. Supply chain problems didn't start with COVID. COVID made them worse, but they were already existing from the conflict between the US and the EU and the US and China. Globalization brings immense economic benefits, from capital flow to the provision of cheap labor, to the exchange of goods and services. I mean, almost all industries benefit from globalization. Technology driven? Yes, because you can have somebody in Dubai, if somebody in India providing service for somebody in Dubai, while both of them are sitting in their offices. But this has also created new and improved opportunities for criminals committing financial crime. The ability to transact with other companies around the world has made it very easy to also move money around the world. And the fact that many financial institutions are either part of or related to or partners with another similar international organization also helps. Yes, it helps move capital around. It helps move commerce around. Yeah, but it also helps move criminal activity around. Cross-border cooperation. Regulators and law enforcement agencies cooperate. An example of the law enforcement agency might be the NCA in the UK, since we're concentrating on the UK, the National Crime Agency. They can cooperate with the FBI, for example, which is the national enforcement agency in the US. So even though technically they are neither of them is international, both of them are local, both of them are national, but they do cooperate. And in many cases, when there is a certain crime like an assassination or something, you'll see certain countries around the world offering help. Like America would say, would you like us to send you the FBI to help with the investigation of this prime minister's assassination, for example? Information is shared, and there are usually cooperation arrangements. An example of that is the BCPS. BCPS stands for the Basel Committee for Banking Supervision. If you are in a bank, you must have heard of the Basel Accord that talks about the minimum capital requirements and supervisory review process and about market discipline. The Basel Committee, which is based in Basel in Switzerland, one of its main functions is to sort of harmonize international regulation. They issue standards on capital adequacy. They talk a lot about moral hazard. They work on reducing bank runs. A bank run is when customers panic and then they start withdrawing cash. Bank will collapse from lack of liquidity. So the BCBS is an example of, because the BCBS is represented, every country is represented in the BCBS by their central bank. The BCBS is part of the Bank for International Settlement, the BIS, and the BIS is the central bank for central banks. So this is an example where all central banks around the world meet, discuss, and agree about cooperation and cooperative matters. Another example of an international cooperation would be the Egmont Group, which is the cooperation of the national FIUs. FIUs is the Financial Information Unit, or the Financial Investigative Unit, depends on the country. So basically, this is the unit where you report your STRs, the special transaction reports. Sometimes they might be parts of central banks. Sometimes they are an independent institution. So just like you have the IOSCO, which is the cooperation of capital market regulators, and the BIS, which is the cooperation of the central banks, Egmont Group is the cooperation of the financial information units, or financial investigative units. The FCA signed the IOSCO Memorandum of Understanding in 2003. Of course, also the UAE and the US and the other countries. And I think IOSCO has members from 180 countries around the world or something like that.